And in terms of the save the cat beats with horror, you mentioned it with the slow burn and relentless horror. How do you think that using the beat sheets kind of specific, like how do you meld it specifically with horror to make it all work?
Yeah, I do think we touched on the hardest one, which is the slow burn. I mean, I think
Right.
that's the hardest one because outside of slow burn, um, the beat sheet works great. Like in relentless horror, it works great. I mean, you can just not to say you don't need my book. It has a lot of other tips about horror. Like I have a lot of other beats I've kind of found that work within. Um, there's one beat I call the in the hands of a madman moment. Um, and the in the hands of a madman moment is like some moment in your story that something so weird, so unexpected, so wild happens that the audience then or the reader then thinks anything can happen in this book. And I
Mhm.
think if you load that in the first half of the book, sometimes in the first act, sometimes in the first page, you get away with a lot of stuff because there's suddenly tension in the reader that anybody could die, any horrible thing could happen. There's extra beats like that that I mentioned a whole bunch of them in the book. Um, but there's other things particular. I'll just go into one that's because it's right up front. The opening image. So I feel pretty strongly that it's in your best interest as a new, maybe if you're an established writer, or maybe if you have a certain that, there's no always do this to any of this stuff, in my opinion. But I think opening image is opening scare. I think I really think you should write an opening scare. And to use movies as an example, there's a bunch of different ones. There's some very obvious ones. I've mentioned Jaws a couple times. The first kill, Chrissy goes swimming out, the shark gets her.
Mhm.
Scream is another great opening, Drew Barrymore on the phone, all this
Mhm.
stuff. In movies, they almost opening scares, I always say the first kills are almost like proof of concept short films for a bigger movie. You know,
Mhm.
and a lot of movies have started out that way. Lights Out started out that way. There's a bunch that came around that started as short films that then they sold and they were like, let's make the feature. And that was their plan. Like they kind of secretly did that. You could see Scream doing that. Like I could
Mhm.
almost see if they didn't do that, but you could almost see if that was a short film, it would
No,
get
yeah.
popular and then they'd be like, oh, this is great. We like this killer. Let's do it. Um,
Oh,
so that's first kill. Um, the origin of the dog's made an appearance.
I know.
The
She's like, okay.
origin, that's awesome. The origin of the monster is or the evil is another way people do opening scares. So something like the puzzle box in Hellraiser or something, the
Mhm.
person
Oh
opens
yeah.
it and you know,
Yeah.
in some ways that could be first kill too. But whatever the origin is, whatever the summon, like sometimes that could be an opening scare. The one I don't like too much, I'm not a fan of, but happens, and even in a movie I broke down in the book, Don't Breathe, it happens, which is a flash forward. Sometimes people do flash forward. So they tell you what's about to happen on page 70, 80, or 90 of a screenplay, or page 300 of a book, and then they cut it off and plant it in your head as, you know,
Mhm.
this is how bad things will get. How did they get so bad? So that's the flash forward. And then I'm going to give you the one that I find if you're stumped and you're writing a story and you just can't think of an opening scare, like none of these make sense. And it's funny. I consult on a lot of screenplays, sometimes novels, but usually screenplays.
Mhm.
And helping people find their opening scare is always fun because a lot of times people don't write it. I'm like, and they get so excited when they find out they could have an opening scare. But sometimes people get stumped. And this one is a trick I see. I'm really building this one up. A trick I see in a lot of movies these days. And it's what I call the horror before the horror. Okay. And the horror before the horror is basically showing the shard of glass of the
Mhm.
main character. Okay. So if you're not familiar with save the cat terms, the shard of glass is the kind of origin story of the trauma behind your hero's arc. That's the shard of glass. So some movies start with the shard of glass scene. So the bad example is like a movie like The Descent or Megan, where there's a car crash in the beginning. Um, the movie Midsommar starts with like a horrific suicide in the beginning. That's very kind of creepy, and it's got a gas mask and stuff. So anyway, the
Mhm.
horror before the horror, if you're really stumped, consider turning your shard of glass into a horror scene.
Yeah, and that's a good idea because it's like you need your shard of glass in your story, and it's probably going to be kind of traumatic. So,
It's yeah, the best movie that does this isn't a horror movie, like, but it's Finding Nemo. Um, yeah, have you ever watched Finding Nemo? They have a very horrific.
it's
It doesn't really play as
it's a
very
rough
horrific, but
beginning,
it's a pretty rough beginning where lots of fish die and it's a monster eats the fish, and
yeah,
it's very horror movie, horror before the horror. It's actually,
yeah.
sadly, it's the best example out there, but it's not from a horror movie.
So that kind of leads me to a question. So it's pretty common to have cold opens in movies, but I know
Hmm.
there's some like sometimes like prologues and books are looked down on. Is that
Right, right.
like different for horror novels, or
I
is it like is there a better way to kind of maybe navigate that?
Yeah, from the horror novels that I've read, I find I because I hear you, like you do hear, don't do prologues, don't do things like that. I find a mix. I find a mix. Like some of them I feel the horror genre tends to do them more than other genres. I think you get away with that quick, kill or something like that. I'm trying to think like my good friend who I co-written screenplays with, he wrote the Clown in a Cornfield series.
Okay.
And I think he writes his books like movies almost. They're almost like, he's a movie fanatic. And and I think he has an opening kill in all of his books. It's like now I don't know if an agent would like that or something, it's hard to say.
Mhm.
Because on the flip side, an agent's going to tell you they want they're probably going to tell you they want something horrific in the first page.
Mhm.
But then on the flip side, they might put boundaries like not a prologue, do it. So it can be kind of tricky for sure.
Yeah, but you could maybe kind of play it with like here's the first scene, but there's like some little mini flashbacks woven in or something
Yeah.
like that, where it's
uh,
like the first
Or
scene, but it's still.
or or the bad example is, yeah, exactly. Like it's the first scene, but they're recounting like that
Mhm.
horrific shard of glass or something like that. I'm sure that would be a compromise you could do. Yeah.
It is tricky. I am jealous of movies having cold opens, and it's like they work so well. You need to set the tone and like set the everything. So
I've written a couple horror books. I've written cold opens in my horror books. I usually just keep them short. But
yeah.
yeah, I always feel like the prologues, like I can understand them for other kinds of stories and things like that.
Mhm.
But I think if you're delivering like a good, I don't know, setting the table kind of horrific
Mhm.
10 pages,
Right.
undeniably horrific, like how can that be a bad thing? Yeah, that's
I'm
my
with
thing.
you. I
Yeah.
am a prologue fan, so
Yes. Yeah, I'm pro prologue. Yeah.
yes, let's start a club.
Yes. Yes.
If you enjoyed this video, we've got a lot more on writingmastery.com. Check the description for links to our blog, free writing tools, and more. Happy writing.